Have You Met Miss Jones is a very popular jazz standard. It's important to know it. I'm guessing most of my viewers, you already know this tune, but let's take a look at it and I'll show you some ideas for how to practice, how to tackle playing over these changes. The B section is actually pretty tricky. Some people think that this was the inspiration for John Coltrane, why he wrote all those tunes, Giant Steps and Countdown and all that stuff, with those 2/5s moving in thirds. I'm not sure if that's true. Wikipedia mentions it. If you know about these things, please let us know in the comments below. But let's just learn the tune first to make sure that we know the tune. So let's get started, shall we? So I've changed the setting in iReal Pro to a Latin feel because again I feel the swing feel is kind of not so great, so it's more fun I think to play with the Latin feel. As always, there's gonna be many different variations on the chords. In the real book it says F sharp diminished, so F major 7 to F sharp diminished, which is it's D7, right? It's just a D functioning as a D7. Here, the G minor to C7. What a lot of people do there, I should mention, is they play a half step chromatic 2/5. So A flat, D flat 7, G minor. So that's quite common, just be aware of that people do that. I've also seen people play, so instead of F, D7, they play F, B flat, A, D7. Those chords are very common to substitute. But I always feel like it's more interesting to remove chords than to add chords. When you go to a jazz lesson with some teacher, they always tell you, oh, you can add this chord here and this sub 5 here and blah, blah, blah. I've always found it more interesting to remove chords to make it more simple, so easier. So we're gonna do that later on. But first, let's just play some bop scales. In order to do that, we need to decide what the bop scales are gonna be. So on F, I'm gonna play F major bop. So it's an F major scale with an added flat 6, which gives me that F major sound. It outlines an F major chord. For the next chord, the D7, I'm gonna play a D mixo with a flat 6 and the flat 9 or flat 2. And then add a major 7, right? If you don't know what bop scales are, I have made many videos about that, and this video is kind of for people who know what bop scales are. And if you don't know what bop scales are, it's a good idea to look into that because it's a very important ingredient in jazz improvisation, if you want to learn bebop, at least I think. For the next chord, G minor 7, I'm gonna ignore that chord and look at the next chord. So the C7, which is C mixo, with an added major 7, which is a C mixo bop scale. Over both those chords. Because when you have a 2/5 like that, the G Dorian and C mixo, they share the same notes. So any material you have for C7 also works for G minor, more or less. Let's say I have that lick. That works over G minor as well as C7. So the bop scale works over both those chords. Now, here's gonna be a little bit more my own take on things. So the next chord is an A minor 7 to D minor 7, G, C. So that A minor is the third chord of the key of F major, which means I'm gonna treat it differently than I normally treat minor chords. Anytime you have that third chord of the key, it functions as a tonic, right? It sounds like a tonic. So that F actually works. And the D minor is also a tonic quality. So I'm gonna play the F major bop scale over both those chords. So that might seem a little bit weird to some people because in jazz school they teach you that F is a void note. But if I play that F in that voicing or in this context, it doesn't sound that weird, right? Whereas if I would play that flat 6 on the other minor chords, it would sound terrible. It would also sound kind of weird if I played Dorian, like on that chord, right? So. So the scale would be Phrygian, I guess, but I'm not thinking A Phrygian. I'm thinking it's an F major. So I'm just gonna play F major bop scale there. Then bridge B flat major bop scale. Again, ignoring the 2 chord and thinking about the dominant, which is D flat. So D flat bop scale. G flat major bop. A dominant bop, D major bop, and then D flat dominant bop, G flat major bop, and C. And then we're back. So I have these scales written out here and I'll play along with the muse score. So let's play along with the muse score. Second ending. So again, this is F major bop. This is D mixo bop with flat 6 and flat 2, C mixo bop. Okay, let's move on to the B section. And we're back. think you're noticing that we're leaving some space there. Some bars and some chords, we're not playing anything. You could extend the bop scale, but I left it open. So we're gonna add stuff to that. That's the next step. But before we do that, we also need to start from the third. So you should also play the bop scales ascending, not only descending. But if I start from the third, it's gonna sound like this, right? Let's try that. I hope you can hear that when I play these scales, you are outlining the harmony. Right? And as I mentioned, I've made many videos on bop scales, and there are tons of videos about bop scales, and my favorite book on the topic of bop scales is Gerber Gonz's book called Jazz Line, where he really covers the topic of bop scales. There are many things you could do with bop scales. You can add stuff. You can kind of play things out of the bop scale or into them. What I want to do here is to play something before the bop scale. So we're gonna play like a triplet, like an arpeggio, leading into the next bop scale. In those places where there was like a space. So here, I'm gonna play this. Right, so it's an arpeggio, aiming and targeting that first note of the bop scale we play. And there's a little chromatic leading note into the arpeggio. So we have this. And here. All right, so let's try that. So this is a little bit different than you normally think about arpeggios. You would normally play the arpeggio that belongs to the chord. So for the A minor, you will play an A minor arpeggio. Here we're actually playing G minor. But that arpeggio is just kind of like a pickup into the bop scale. We're playing something bop scale, if you know what I mean. So it doesn't matter. It's kind of a different approach. And if you listen to Charlie Parker and look at his solos, he often does that. He'll play arpeggios that are not the chord. And you might be thinking, where is he deriving these arpeggios from? And I think it's just So if you have a F major scale, for example, or C mixolydian, it's the same thing, right? The same notes. You could play an arpeggio into any of those notes with that chromatic note. And then continue on a bop scale, which could be either the F major bop scale or the C mixo bop scale, depending on what the note is. And sometimes the note belongs to both. So if I have a key, let's say I loop those first 4 bars of this tune. I have like F major for 4 bars. Now I could experiment with playing those arpeggios leading into either the F major bop scale or the C mixo. Would think that you could only play the C mixo for the G minor C7, which is kind of the dominant section of those chords, and the F major bop for the first 2 chords. And here I'm totally ignoring that there's a D7. I'm thinking F for both those 2 chords. We're gonna talk about that later on. But it actually doesn't matter that much because we're in the key, kind of. I don't know if you agree, but I think it sounds pretty good. But you definitely want to be aware of if you're on the dominant chord or the tonic. But even the C mixo bop scale kind of sounds good over the F if you do it in this way. Kind of. But you have to kind of know what you're doing, I guess. I should mention also that, of course, you should be able to start the bop scales on the 5th and whatever the next note is, if it's a 7th or a 6th. Depending on what scale it is. Now, if I start from the 3rd and do this, we can get something like this, which is even weirder because it's a B flat major arpeggio over the A minor, which technically wouldn't work. But I'm not thinking that I'm superimposing an arpeggio over the A. I'm thinking that I'm targeting that note, if that makes sense. So let's listen to that. So these PDFs, these examples are going to be as PDFs on my Patreon page, but I want you to continue exploring this by yourself. That's how you learn instead of me writing everything out. It's better if you understand the concept, what I'm doing, you can take this further and continue with the other starting notes on the bop scales and experiment with arpeggios and all this stuff. Now that we have some scales under our fingers, I want to look at some other ideas for practicing this tune. So I'm actually going to make it simpler, so I made a variation in iReal Pro that looks like this. And remember, when you go in and alter, edit the chords in iReal Pro, you want to use the function duplicate before you edit. Otherwise, you're destroying the original version, which can be annoying. So I always use duplicate. So here I simplified the chords a little bit. So it's F6 to D minor. And then I use pedals for the B section. So let's give it a listen. So I could just play F major. I want to be aware of that note. Okay, so the A section. So I also changed the A minor to F. So D minor. So I could play F major over the whole thing. At the A's first ending anyway. So I often tell students to do that. This is like using key centers. So it's all F. I often make this point in my videos that the second chord there, the D7, calls for like a D altered or a D mixo flat 2 flat 6 or some kind of dominant scale that fits those altered chords, right? But there's a misunderstanding by the student. They often think that, oh, I have to play all those extensions. But if you ever played jazz in a real situation, you know that all those kind of rules, they go out the window when you're actually playing on the bandstand with people. And if you listen to jazz musicians, they don't always play every time there's a dominant chord an altered scale or something. Quite the contrary. They often don't do that. You don't have to play anything. You can leave space. But you can also kind of treat it as F major. And if I think of that D7, if I play an F major scale over it, it's not that weird. Like the F is the sharp 9 and the E is the 9th, which should be a flat 9 kind of, but it's just one note that is off. So as long as I'm not emphasizing that note, it's gonna sound good. Now, here is my caveat. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to play dominant chords, altered scales and all this stuff. But you need to be able to do that, which takes a lot of practice. But if you can do that, that also means that you don't have to do that. But if I can't play the altered scales, then I don't have that option. But if I can play them, I have the option of also not playing them, if you know what I mean? So I'm not saying that you shouldn't practice D altered over that D chord or whatever diminished or scale you want to use. You should practice all that stuff. You should be able to do that. But if you play an altered scale every time there's a dominant chord, it's gonna sound annoying. It's gonna sound like I'm trying to speak, I don't know, use advanced language all the time or something like that. Now, let's say I do want to practice those chords. The difference between those two scales is it's the F sharp and the E flat, right? So instead of F, it's F sharp. Instead of E, it's E flat. So if I loop those chords, so F major, so I can practice kind of catching those notes that are different, because all the other notes are the same. You also want to include the next chord, the G minor, because that D7, you should practice D7 going to G minor. So find ways of connecting those, landing on the chord tone of that G minor. Maybe a diminished arpeggio. Or a scale run. Right? So it's a funny thing, right? Like we always practice play this scale over this chord and then play this scale over the next chord. But what we actually should be practicing is how to connect the scales. So in order to do that, you need to know where's my line going. So if I play a mixo flat 2, flat 6, I'm landing on the third of the next chord. So now let's do that with the B section, which is trickier, right? But there are some things that we can use. So the first chord is B flat, then it's A flat minor. So if I play a superimposed arpeggio over that A flat minor, which is C flat, that's a half step above B flat. So I'll show you what I mean. Here are the first chords of the B section. So I can play a B flat major arpeggio and just move it up a half step. So I'm just playing major 7 arpeggios, B flat, B, G flat. It's actually C flat, but it's easier to think of a B. Then the same thing for the next transition, right? So G flat, then it's an E minor, when you can play a G major, which is a half step up. If I loop those chords as well, E minor, it's like side slipping. So all I'm doing there is playing major 7 arpeggios, which can help you kind of maneuver through those changes. So what I'm doing kind of sometimes when it's a tricky chord change, like here's a tricky chord change in the B section, there are many, those chord changes are tricky, is that I zoom in on the tricky change and loop that. Like you can loop in iReal Pro, or I use like a loop pedal like I'm doing here, until it opens up and I can kind of hear the harmony and find ways to transition those chords. So just to recap what we talked about today, playing bebop scales is a good way to play over standard like this. And then you need to kind of add things to the bop scales. You add arpeggios and chromatic things. That's kind of the Charlie Parker language, right? It's arpeggios, triplet kind of rapid arpeggios, leading into chromaticism and bop scales. Bop scales is basically introduction to chromaticism. You're still outlining the harmony. And then you can think key centers, and you don't have to play every chord that is kind of outside of the key, because these tunes from this era, this type of tune, they're still in the key. This is in F major, except the B section where it moves around, which is actually unusual for this kind of American songbook tunes. And that's why jazz musicians love to play it. But the A section, you can just play F major, but I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying. I don't mean that, oh, I don't have to play any altered scales or diminished scales. I could just play F major. No, you still have to work on that stuff. But if you work on that stuff too much, you might feel like yeah, when you go to a real gig or a jam session, like nothing is coming out because that stuff is not gonna come out naturally until you really master that stuff. So at the same time, you should try to just play these tunes just by ear, right? And play like I showed you. There's think key centers. I have also a little bit of housekeeping here. I've started another playlist where I do Cole Porter tunes and bi-weekly. And if you want all the Cole Porter tunes that I'm gonna go through, you have to become a member of Patreon. So then you get access to all the tunes. And for those of you who are doing that, and if you're still watching, I want you to try these things. Everything that I show in these videos, you can apply to the Cole Porter tunes. And so, yeah, I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I want to thank you for your time and attention, and I shall see you next time.